Okay. Welcome to our kind of virtualistic class. I do want to firstly start off by saying I hope you all are safe with the current snow that we're having. They did predict some level of snow, and it did make impact the way, maybe not in the way that they thought, but it did make some significant impact that is not allowing us to come to school tomorrow. So you all have an extra day to really just kind of catch up on work or complete work that you need to do, right? But as for our class, unfortunately, we can't really lose too much steam. So we have to keep going in this virtual format and really just going, by any means necessary, right? Actually, let me take this screen record thing off. There we are. All right. So what we need to do is talk about types of democracy, right? I have a bell ringer for here. When we all return, I'll kind of reiterate the notebook and bell ringer thing, right? And as I'm doing this lecture, I'll kind of reference back to this. So, right, so I'm kind of giving you the answer while teaching it at the same time, right? However, the biggest thing for us today is learning about types of democracies, right? As you can see here, noted here. Now, I am going to caution you, I will not be going through these slides. I urge you, as you're watching this video, have these slides pulled up and go through them with me. I am going to be on a sketch pad, as you can see at the top of my toolbar up here, right? And I'm kind of going to be drawing out examples, talking about different concepts, writing different definitions to really, drive home certain points that the AP test really needs you all to know, right? So we can get started. Make sure you are understanding that this is Unit 1 still, right? We're in Chapter 1. This is Section 1.2. Okay. So let's look at these learning objectives really quick. Now, I know I put these here, as a precursor, right? But it really is important, especially here in AP, that we understand what learning objectives are and how crucial they are to your understanding on the AP exam, right? So let's look at learning objective 1.2a. Um, all this is really saying is, or what really what I need you to know is how to explain models of representative democracy, right? And how these things show up in real American institutions, how they show up in our policies that are made, and how they show up in debates that take place in our country, right? So I mean, it's cool if you define them, right? But that's not going to get you very far on an AP exam. You need to not only define them, but you really have to recognize them and be able to use them in scenarios, into action statements, right? You really need to know this like the back of your hand, right? So it's important that you know how a representative democracy truly works. Okay? And let's take a look at this second learning objective 1.3a, right? Federalists and anti-federalists. You're going to see a lot of this throughout Unit 1, and you're going to see a lot of federalist and anti-federalist, viewpoints throughout the rest of AP government, right? So you really need to understand their views on central government and democracy. And you might be saying, Mr. Williams, why is that important? But it's because, this debate has literally stemmed from 1787 and has determined the kind of democracy we have to this day, right? So Federalist and anti-Federalist views are still very, very prevalent in American society. Okay? All right. Cool. If you will, make sure you are on. This is slide 4. This is types of democracy. I'm going to make my way over here really quick and start to talk about and draw out some things regarding the three different types of democracies. All right. Let's start. So, types of democracies, we're going to define them first. It's very important that we define them, right? So, what is, which is what the US has is a representative democracy. And it takes very many different forms, right? I like to think of them as different flavors of democracy, if that might be able to help you visualize it. Like if you go to a fast food place and you like get to choose your soda, like, you have Sprite, you have Dr. Pepper, and you have all these different flavors. Well, think of it like that. Like you have pluralist democracy. I mean democracy. You have an elite democracy. You have different democracies that will that definitely dictate our society. All right, let's look at a participatory democracy. Right, Participatory. Okay. Mr. Williams, hope he spelled that right. All right. So this is what I like to call the power of the people, right? Power of the people democracy. A power of the people, right? Um, this is where people hold a good share of the power, right? I'm not gonna draw a fist because I'm gonna be really bad at it, but like imagine this is a fist, and like that's the hand is like standing for justice or the power, right? I'm not really an artist, so please don't depend on me for good drawings. All right. But look, in this model, citizens, right? So think about you all in a couple years, especially as you all turn 18 and 19, 20, right? Think about you all. We'll draw some of you all here, right? This is some of the AP Gov kids, right? In this kind of democracy, you all have a lot of power, more power than, a lot of other democracies would have, right? So this is you all. This is the power of the people model. Um, and you all, right, this little group of AP students, you all are directly involved in decisions that the government gets to make, right? This is all you. So think about like a town hall meeting, right? Town hall meeting. Okay. So all of you are attending this town hall meeting, right? Um, and town hall meetings are basically where you get information, right? This is where you acquire information about what's going on with local government, right? You get to understand what decisions are being made, how they're being made, who's making them, and why they're making them, right? Um, we also need to talk about in these town hall meetings. A lot of times, you can have this thing called, and let me make sure I put a little arrow down there, a referendum, right? And this is where you vote directly. That word is important. Directly on laws, right? You vote directly on the laws that are happening in a referendum. Okay? So, AP kids, you all, you directly make decisions, you attend the town hall meeting, you get the information, participate in the referendum, you vote directly on laws. Right? It's like one hierarchy system, right? You know, if we look at like a little triangle, right? This is a bad triangle, but there are you all at the bottom, right? You have to attend the meeting, right? You have to attend this meeting. Then you can get a referendum. I'm gonna put RF, right? And then the decision takes place, right? After you voted on it, because you are the primary decision maker. Okay, it's pretty easy to remember. All right, that you're the primary decision maker. Okay. One other group that I do want to talk about, and I'm going to add a new page here. Right, one group that I do want to talk about, not that kind of page. All right, are people who participate in grassroots activism. Right, you're probably saying, Mr. Williams, why is grass revolting? They're not. Grassroots activism, right? Grassroots activism. All that simply means is you, an individual, you have a complaint. So this is you. I hate, I don't know, I hate tests, right? So now what you do is you have this bright idea that you hate tests and tests should not be allowed. So now you convince a bunch of other people, right, that tests are bad. I hate this. And everybody's like, yeah, I kind of hate this too. And the other person's like, yeah, tests are kind of stupid. You even convince somebody who used to love tests, right? They're like, I really, really hate this, right? And we all know who came up with this idea. It would be Miss Griffin. She hates tests after loving tests for some reason. So one day she woke up and said, I really hate tests, right? Okay. So Miss Griffin says, I hate tests. Cool. Well, now she's convinced a bunch of you all that you don't like them either. So you all form this huge coalition. You're going to form a coalition, right? Which is basically just a group, right? This is just a group. And y'all's whole entire goal, right? I'm gonna try my best to draw a little light bulb right here, right? This is really bad. That's really bad. Again, I'm not an artist, right? You had a bright idea, right? That hey, I we don't like tests, so we're going to go lobby to our school. So you're going to go to Hillside, right? And all the decision makers in Hillside, right? This is Hillside, and you're going to say, hey, we don't want tests, right? This is called you all becoming one group. Remember, a coalition being the group. You had a great idea. You don't want tests anymore. You go to the decision makers here at our school at Hillside, right? And this is you all expressing your, participatory democracy, right? The key word here is direct. Citizens or you all aren't just voting for people, right, who make decisions. You're making the decisions yourself, right? So, Ms. Griffin isn't waiting on one of the assistant principals or the principal to make a decision about tests. She's taking the power in her own hands and saying, hey, I am a student here. I have a voice. I have a right to, to voice what I need, right? And so I'm going to go and say, hey, we don't want tests. We hate tests. It's slowing our learning down. And actually, it's hurting us more than it's helping us, right? So that's about grassroots activism. All right, let's create another page. Okay, let's look at a pluralist democracy, right? This is the many voices model, right? I like to call, I'm gonna put it right here, pluralist. There we go. Pluralist democracy. Okay, let's get rid of this for some reason. This is the many voices democracy, or many voices model is what I like to call it, right? Okay, so it recognizes that society has diverse interests and competing groups. So, like labor unions, business associations, environmental groups, and different professional organizations, they all compete and negotiate to influence policy. There's no single group that dominates because there are so many groups checking each other essentially. I think the best place would to think of it is like think of it like a marketplace. Like, if you go to a market where they sell different things, you have different vendors that sell different things, right? But this is like a marketplace of ideas and interests, right? So we can draw like a little market right here, right? We can call this the GOV, or government market. So at this government market, right, there's so many different people that are here selling different things, right? On this one stand, right? We got people selling, I don't know, what interest would they sell? They could sell, um, they love trees. That is what they are lobbying for. You have one stand over here that, you know, wants to change classes. They hate how classes are structured. They want to change the way they change classes. All right. And then you have another person over here, right, that l- really loves um, sports, and they want to lobby that everyone should play a sport, right? So in the pluralist democracy, there's so many different voices, right? And think of it like checks and balances. All these groups check each other, right? Kind of look like I wrote the FOIL method in math, right? Again, this is not a math class. Let me get rid of this. All right. But these all are checking each other. So it is in a pluralist democracy. When you have too many voices, and I do want you all to really think about this, when you have too many voices, or what I like to say, too many cooks in the kitchen, right? It's really hard to get stuff done, right? Because there's a lot of people, having these competing thoughts. And when you have a lot of competing thoughts, a lot of times things don't get accomplished, right? So that's important to note. Okay. So think of this like scenario B from your bell ringer, and we'll kind of go back to it really quick. Let's see. Here we are. Let's go think about scenario B. So it's about healthcare reform, right? And if you look at it, this is a pluralist democracy, right? You've got 50 plus interest groups. So you got doctors, these different insurance companies, patients, drug companies, and unions. They're all lobbying on, lobbying Congress on different on healthcare, right? They're competing. They're trying to negotiate, and they're trying to influence the finality of that bill that's going to get passed or potentially passed, right? So this definitely is a pluralist democracy. Okay, let's go back and let's create a new page. All right, an elite democracy. Elite democracy um, is really, really simple, right? It might be the simplest of them all. And all this means is, right, this is what I like to call the educated leadership model. And you're probably saying, what does that mean? Well, I'll tell you. A lot of critics called it the wealthy few, which means, you know, small amounts of people or groups actually make change, right? So small amounts of people, right? But if I'm saying elite, what comes to mind when I say elite, right? I want you to think about that, right, as I continue explaining, right? So, as you think, you're probably thinking, okay, rich people, right? The rich people, right? Who else probably comes to your mind? People with a lot of social status, right? Or people who are like experts, right? Let me put this in quotations. People who might be experts in a certain subject, right? Think of it like this. I would say the majority of citizens have limited direct participation. Remember we talked about earlier, and participate direct was the main word we want to use, but now in the elite democracy, they've taken all that away from you. All that is gone now, right? The majority of citizens have limited direct participation, and only the elites make decisions, right? Or they make most of the decisions, I'll say, right? I kind of want to link it to this. Let me erase this right here really quick. I'm going to erase this and show you a really, really unique example. All right. Do, 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 do. Okay. So let's get back to the drawing. You all are probably going to go to college one day, right? Could you imagine in a world, right, where a bunch of these different jobs, right, and like jobs, law schools, med schools, etc., right? They all said, "Hey, if you don't go to the Ivy, like if you don't go to the Ivy League, you don't go to the Ivy League, you don't go to Duke, you don't go to Stanford, right? These super super elite colleges. Like if you don't go to these, then you can't get into any of those, right? You can't have a nice job. So, no nice job, no law school, no med school, right? That it's not happening, right? If you don't go to the Ivy League, right, the 8 schools in the Ivy League, like Harvard, Yale, Brown, Princeton, Columbia, etc., you don't go to Duke, you don't go to Stanford, you don't go to a Vanderbilt, right? These are all Ivy adjacent schools, right? You don't go to Vandy, you don't go to Stanford, you don't go to Duke. Well, then you're not going to go to law school. I'm not going to let you into med school. I can't let you have a nice job, right? That is what an elite democracy looks like. People who only achieve the top status get the nice things, right? And don't get to have anything. That's kind of what they're getting at in the elite democracy. Okay? Okay, cool. Let's now talk about debate over types. because this is when it gets really interesting and really important for our AP examination that's coming up in May. Um, During and after the Constitutional Convention in 1787, right? Constitutional Convention, I'm going to label it CC 1787, right? Cool. So after this happened, like after it happened, there was a really, really big debate slash argument between these two groups, right? We call them Federalists, right? And Anti-Federalists. All right, cool. I'm gonna make a little T chart, right, to get the ooh, not like that at least. Okay, all right. So I'm gonna make a little T chart to highlight their differences. That was very unexpected, by the way. I don't know what happened there. Let's erase that though. I'm gonna erase it the best I can, and then we'll continue. All right. Technical difficulties. Okay, so let's make a little T chart. My line is not straight. I apologize. Okay, we're looking at these two groups, Federalists and Anti-Federalists, right? Well, Federalists, right? They disagree. Well, Federalists and Anti-Federalists disagreed a lot on how things should be. How strong should the government be, or central government, right? Do we need a Bill of Rights, and how states should relate to the federal government? But one key element was, of their dispute was which type of democracy to implement. So we go back to those three earlier, and they were trying to figure out what do we implement, right? How do we do it? Okay, so the Federalists, they are going to write, these long series of papers, called the Federalist Papers, right? So they were called I'm gonna call them the Fed Papers, right? The Fed Papers, right? And these were only written, right? And this is really important that you catch this. These are only written to convince states, right? They only wrote these to convince states to ratify the Constitution, to ratify all that means is to change, right? To change or, edit, right? To change or edit, right? And that's what the Fed papers were written for. They were written to ratify or change, right? Or edit the Constitution, right? So you get this thing called Federalist number 10, Fed number 10, right? And it's written by James Madison. James Madison wrote this. So James Madison, and don't forget him, he is the architect of this thing, right? This is his thing. He's the architect of the Constitution, right? All things point to James Madison. Okay? So, and what he through the Constitution, right? Him being the architect of the Constitution, the Fed 10, right here, Fed 10, it's going to argue for controlling negative effects of factionalism through a representative democracy. So at the end of the day, they wanted a representative democracy, right? It's important that we understand this. Okay, let me continue on through this. All right, let's add. There we go. All right, so we sticking with Federalists right now, right? So you're probably saying, "Hey, Mr. Williams, what's a faction, right?" Well, a faction, and the simplest way I can put it is a group, and this is kind of how Madison defines it as well. So I'm kind of defining it the same, but Madison definitely um, said they were. Madison said they're united. They're united by some common interest. By some common interest. Okay, so there's a common interest that they are, bound by, or what they're united by, right? But, through that common interest, it's adverse to the rights of other citizens, right? Or the overall good. Think of it as an interest group that might hurt others to help themselves, right? So, sure, Madison said is united by some common interest, right? That's what a faction is. However, they hurt people in the process. They hurt people in the process, right? That's what they do, right? It's like somebody evil. It's like you. It's like you helping somebody. This is like your little y'all's handshake, and they shake your hand, but see they're evil, right? And then you're very happy because you like them. You think they're good. You think they're neat, right? And then some years down the line, right? This is you after they betrayed you. You got the puppy eyes. You got tears, and why would you do this? And then here they are, maniacal laugh, and mwahaha. Yeah. So, that's what happens. You know, they hurt you in the end, right? Because they wanted to have their way. They were just a sly little interest group that lied to poor you, right? You were naive, and then they ran off with everything that you had, right? That's a faction, you know. And then they had other people join them, who have similar interests, who are also evil, right? And all these people ran off with everything that you had. It's unfortunate, but it happens. That's a faction. Okay? All right. So, Madison, and I'll make this one quick. Madison's argument is that both support pluralist and elite democracy models. So you're probably saying, Mr. Williams, wait. You just said, the Federalists support the representative democracies, right? So how is this possible? Well, Madison kind of says that, a large, diverse republic prevents any single faction from dominating, right? When you have a lot of competing interests spread across a big country like the colonies were, right? No one group can take over. That's pluralist, but he also argues for representatives, educated, virtuous leaders who refine and enlarge public views rather than direct democracy. So Madison, in a sense, Madison was against was against you voting directly on things, right? He was against you voting directly. He supported more. You know, Madison supports voting smart people in, voting smart, smart experts, right? Madison supports voting smart experts in, okay? Which means he wants you, right? He wants you to vote these people in and they'll make the decisions for you, right? He's saying that doesn't allow factions to take over the country, right? So that's what he's saying. If, these people who are really, experts in their subject matter, they, can make the best decision, right? And the reason why they can make that great decision is because, they have more intelligence or they've spent more time around that specific subject matter than you have. Okay? So, I would like to point out this is what I like to call an elite democracy that Madison was pushing for. No matter how much he tries to say he wasn't, Madison was definitely pushing for an elite democracy. Okay? Just make sure you understand that. All right. Then on the flip side, you get this thing, Brutus One, right? Brutus One is another kind of document, right? But it was written by an anti-federalist. So Brutus One was written by an anti-federalist. Okay, we don't actually know who Brutus was. Kind of just a pen name, right? But this essay does, right, is basically in response to the Federalist 10, and it expresses the actually opposite concern. So Brutus one, was, opposite of Fed 10. Okay, so he says, what if elites consolidate power, right? Consolidate means that just really, put all the power into a small group of people, right? And dominate the government. What if the large republic Madison wants actually makes citizens feel distant from their representatives, right? So he's saying, what if, if we look at, I'm going to draw a terrible congressional building, right? Little flag at the top for America, right? Congress. All right. And these are like supposed to be steps. And then the door. All right. So what if, and we're going to have little windows, with the little people in them, right? These are all supposed to be all the little elite members, right? There's a them. There they are, right? So Brutus says, what if all these people here, all these elite people, you see these 8 people right here, right? What if they consolidate all that power, right? What if they do that and dominate the government, right? So there, you all the AP kids, y'all are all outside, right? Lobbying for stuff or trying to lobby for stuff or vote for stuff, but they've put up a barrier between you. There's a barrier now, right? You all can't get to the government and you will never make another decision. So all your voices, right, they're hitting this brick wall while they enjoy a bunch of power. Right? So that's the concern Brutus had about Fed 10 and, Federalists in general, right? So Brutus is going to, advocate for a more participatory democracy, right? Brutus says people need to make decisions, for themselves. We didn't break away from Britain, just to not have our, say in government, okay? Right? So we deserve a say. I'm going to put it here in this little box over here, right? So Brutus won, anti-feds wanted a direct democracy, right? They wanted more direct, or what we call participatory. Wanted participatory. It will not let me do the Y over here. I'm gonna do it like that. Okay. All right. That's what the Brutus or the anti-feds wanted, right? They wanted this. They want a participatory democracy. Okay. All right. So it's important that you all understand that. All right. Brutus advocates, and I'm going to stay on Brutus for maybe another 30 seconds, right? Brutus advocates for a participatory democracy, more direct involvement, local control, citizens closely, make are connected to decision making. The anti-federalists worried that a large republic with a strong central government would create tyranny by elites who were far removed from ordinary people, right? Anti-feds, you know, obviously they supported Brutus, right? Their goal was strong central government could create or could lead to this thing called tyranny, right? And we've discussed tyranny in class, right? When we were talking about Declaration of Independence. Strong central government can create tyranny because the people, right? And we'll draw the people who were once normal are far removed from reality now. They're no longer representative of the people, and in a sense, they can become a bit tyrannical, right? They rule without considering other people, right? So that's something the anti-feds really, really were big on and worried about. Okay, kids, I tell you this: in the AP exam, when you take the AP exam, the Constitution, and please notice the Constitution that emerged, right, incorporated elements from both perspectives. So not one competing idea won; both had their ideas put into the Constitution. It was a compromise, right? We have representative structures and checks on majority power, and that's very federalist, right? Checks and balances. Think legislative, executive, judicial. That's a federalist idea, right? But we also have federalism with strong state governments, right? And we eventually got the Bill of Rights. And that's an anti-federalist policy, right? You know, the U.S. isn't one model. We're not a direct democracy. We're not participatory. We're not pluralist. Um, we are a blend of everything. We're a hybrid, right? So the Bill of Rights was to protect the states, and then the strong sense of government was to protect federalists. So you know, it's important that you know that for the AP exam. All right, let's continue with the next slide. It's a continuation of debate over types. Okay, let's see. Let me do this. Let me go to the slide really fast. On this slide, you can see an original copy of the Federalist Papers, right? And the beginning of Brutus 1. So these are actually founding documents, the kind of primary sources you'll analyze on the AP exam, right? When you do read Federalist 10, and don't worry, we will read Federalist 10 together, you got to know the key arguments, right? From where it came from. So Madison says, look, people from factions or people form factions. That's human nature, right? In a small direct democracy, one faction can take over and oppress the minority. But in a really, really large republic with representation, you get so much diversity that factions have no choice but to check each other, right? And representatives can filter out dangerous passions or people who have dangerous opinions, right? That's really what the Fed 10 is arguing for in James Madison, right? They're saying, hey, there's a need to control negative effects of factionalism through a representative democracy because Madison's hope was that, hey, if you say something really, really wicked and wild, there'll be somebody else to say, I don't really know about that. Let's not go there, right? So his hope was somebody would check each other or people would check each other, right? So let's look at Brutus 1, okay? The author is saying, and this is in response to Fed 10, he's saying, hey, hold on. This large republic you're proposing is way too big, right? Representatives won't really know their constituents. Constituents are just, you know, the people who, you know, exist within the community who are engaged, right? Constituents are the people, right? So Brutus says, representatives won't know the people. They remember he said they're tyrannical and they're far removed from the people, right? He says the government is too far away. Power is going to concentrate in the hands of the elite and the rich. We need smaller and more local government, right? We need smaller and more local control where people, the real people on the ground can actually participate, right? Kids, both these documents show up on the AP exam. I repeat, both of these documents show up on the AP exam. You need to know their main arguments. And remember, this was not just some abstract philosophy. States were legitimately deciding whether to ratify the Constitution, right? What to do with it, right? And how they were going to do with it. This debate determines the country we have today, right? So it's important you know this. The Constitution, again, I'm going to repeat this, includes both elements, right, from both sides. Now, ultimately, the Federalists won the ratification fight or the editing fight or the changing fight, but the anti-Federalists completely forced them to compromise by adding the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights only exists because of anti-Federalists, and that was to protect states from big government, right? So it's important that we understand that concept, okay? Okay, let's look at the Federalist arguments, all right? We're going to dive a bit deeper into them. Um, so we'll do that. All right. Let's look at James Madison, right? After the Constitution was drafted, it needed ratification by three-fourths of the states, right? So that's at that time it was only 13, so you only needed nine, right? And this is during the late 1780s, right? So during this ratification period, or during this editing period, both sides, anti-federalists and federalists, published essays. They had their debates, and they made their cases to state legislators or people, people who made decisions, right? So one group, and let me actually do this really quick. Go back to my sketch pad. Federalists included these people. All right. So you'll see, obviously, James Madison. He's the most important. Alex Hamilton. Let me get rid of this. All right. So Alex Hamilton and John Jay. Okay. Um, all of these dudes right here, they all argue that a strong central government, so strong central government, that looks that looks like a pot. Okay. Strong central government, right? They're advocating for this thing right here. Okay. And all they're saying is, right, that hey, we need a stable and competent government. Remember, because they just lived through the Articles of Confederation. That thing failed miserably. And they created a very weak government, right? Remember, the Articles of Confederation wouldn't even allow them to collect taxes. I call them the AOCs. You know, it created weak government, right? They these dudes did not want to go back to this, right? Did not want to go back to this. Okay, so Madison's key argument in Fed 10 was a large republic is superior to a small republic in control of the mischiefs of faction, right? I want you to think about it logically. In a small republic, say one state, you might have farmers versus merchants, or like people who collect debts versus the people who make the debt, right? One group could gain majority control and pass laws that harm the other groups. But in a large republic spanning 13 states with these very different climates, different economies, different populations, right? You've got farmers, merchants, and manufacturers, right? So it's like the difference between a small pond where one big fish can control everything, and versus an ocean with countless species checking each other, right? So nothing goes haywire. Madison also emphasized dispersing power between states and national government, which is federalism in a nutshell, right? So it protects against tyranny while allowing for experimentation. So states can have different policies like we do today. Good ideas spread, and he said bad ideas would stay contained, right? For the AP exam, I do want you to know Madison trusted representatives and large-scale republicanism to control factions, not direct democracy or small republics, right? He was advocating for a more pluralist and elite democratic model, right? All right, let's go to anti-federalism and we'll be done here. All right, let's look at the anti-federalists because their concerns were serious and legit, right? And they shaped our final constitution. So even though they lost the ratification fight, they still had a big impact with the Bill of Rights. In general, anti federalists opposed ratification in favor of a weaker central government. They wanted power by the states mainly because they said, well, who knows the constituents of each state like the states, right? Like if you live in North Carolina, it's kind of hard for somebody in New York to make decisions about your life. Y'all live two very different lives, right? And this is what Brutus 1 really embodies, right? Is grounded in popular democratic theory, direct democracy, the idea that democracy works best when citizens are close to their representatives, and can actively participate in governance, right? He said, if you don't have a voice, then how do we truly have a democracy? Okay. Anti-federalists benefit a lot of a local government, right? Think about it from their perspective. You're in a small state, you might actually know your representative, you can hold them accountable, you understand local issues, but in the massive republic that federalists want, right? How can that ever be a thing, right? How can you ever get close to those people? If they make a bad decision, you can never challenge them on it because you don't know them, right? And that was their issue with federalism, okay? So they were deeply concerned about protecting their individual rights, their state rights, and preventing oppression by the judiciary. Notice that Article 3 of the Constitution, right? Um, it creates the judicial branch, right? Unfortunately, it was super vague compared to Articles 1 and 2, so the Anti Federalists were worried who will check the Supreme Court, right? So most importantly, the Anti-Federalists demanded a Bill of Rights. They insisted that if you're creating this powerful central government, you need explicit or real protections for individual freedom, speech, religion, press, assembly, due process, jury trials, protection, and against unreasonable searches, right? The Federalists initially said this wasn't necessary. So remember, James Madison people didn't like this, right? But and the Constitution only grants limited powers. So why list what the government can't do, right? But the Anti-Federalists pushed back hard, and ultimately, the first 10 amendments were added as a condition of ratification. All right, I think those are our slides. What I will say for this slide is for your AP test, um, the Anti-Federalist position advocated for a participatory government. Think about you, right? You want to directly vote on laws in our school. You would directly want a direct democracy. Okay, so remember, make sure you understand that. So close. So what I want to say in closing is, what you need to know is, and I'll go back to the bell ringer, right? The Vermont town meeting is a participatory democracy, right? Anti-Federalists would have loved this because citizens directly decide issues. Section B is more so interest groups, right? It's more of a pluralist democracy. Madison would point to this as proof that the system worked. Right? Actually, let me go up here real quick. There we go. So yeah, Madison would point to to this saying, hey, the system works, right? Diverse factions competing, preventing any one group from dominating. However, Scenario C, where wealthy donors influence Supreme Court selection, this is an elite democracy. Anti Federalists will say, we told you so. So you Federalists don't freaking listen, right? And this is exactly what they're worried about, concentrated power amongst the elite. The big question from your bell ringer was, which scenario should represent all of American government? Here's the thing, none of them should stand alone. I'll be honest with you. Our system works precisely because it incorporates all three in different ways, right? So for when we do return, right, we'll look at specific constitutional structures that emerge from this debate. So like separation of powers, federalism, checks and balances. You'll see how the founders try to create a new system that prevents tyranny while still getting things done. All right. So for now, make sure your notes clearly distinguish between participatory, pluralist, and elite democracy, and that you can explain Fed 10 and Brutus number one's main arguments because those are AP exam essentials. Okay. All right. I will see you all in class. Look, make sure you understand that you will see more of these recordings in the future, right? I'm going to be doing a lot of these for us just to ensure that we really can drive these points home. All right, I will see you then.